the Oxford University Press about the ways in which food and drink were used in the Eucharist in earliest times. And essentially, even though I hadn't gone looking for this, it turned out that the question of whether and how the Eucharist is sacrificial was really core to the ways that Christians made decisions about what should go in the cup or not, or what should be on the altar or not. Now, I'm not going to talk so much about Eucharist and sacrifice tonight, but of course, as an early church historian, my sort of radar lit up coming across an issue about Eucharist and sacrifice, because of course it's so fundamental to questions that are perhaps more familiar in terms of Anglican identity, like the 16th century controversies about whether and how the Eucharist is a sacrifice. And again, we may get into those in conversation, but they're not my primary focus. I actually want to take us back even a little bit further tonight to sort of think about the question of how we think about sacrifice and how differently we might think about sacrifice from the characters whom we encounter in Scripture. And so one way to think about this sort of the question I want to pose, offered under that title of living sacrifices, is this: how did we get from thinking about sacrifice as a ritual activity to thinking about sacrifice as primarily an ethical disposition? And if that isn't clear, then I have a PowerPoint for you. So bear with me. Let's see if this does what it's supposed to. So
you want to see that, I hope? Yep.
Now, I know this is not the Toronto Blue Jays, but you as North Americans are supposed to know something about baseball. And I know a few of you have talked about other parts of North America. I, as an Australian, should be here to explain to you the intricate rules of cricket. But instead, I want to show you my cultural sensitivity by using an example based upon one of North America's games. If you Google the word sacrifice, which you may do even during the course of this conversation or later, you will find it in contemporary language being used in reference to two or three things above all. And one of them is depicted for you. What on earth am I saying? What are we talking about here to imagine sacrifice having to do with the game of baseball? Anybody want to try?
Well, I think it was in one of your, it's Carol Finley answering, but I think it was in something that I read this afternoon about a fly ball, which would disqualify the batter. I don't know much about baseball, so excuse me.
Very well.
However, it would help somebody who was on one of those bases get further and maybe make a home run after the ball was caught.
Exactly. Now, Carol, by having done her homework, has shamed those who think that they know more about baseball by explaining this perfectly well.
Well, if I could just add to that.
Yes, please, David.
I was surprised when I heard about you started to talk about baseball and the sacrifice hit, because the one I'm more familiar with is less spectacular. It's the sacrifice bunt.
Yes, which is another version of the same idea.
Right.
In both cases, the reason this works for our purposes is that in the game, if we think of the game as a kind of metaphor of life, a sort of parable, the batter actually gives up their own inning or their own capacity to score by not understanding that they will be tagged or caught out, depending on whether we're talking about the bunt or the fly, but that because of the way in which the play works, other players who are on base are able to advance. So once the ball is in the fly, which is the one that is indeed the heart of my metaphor, once the fly ball is caught in baseball, unlike in cricket where play stops, as it should, obviously in a civilized sort of fashion. In baseball, the players who are on base are live again, and they're free to advance so long as the ball isn't then returned to the infield to tag them or stop them from proceeding. So the logic of the sacrifice fly is again this, that the batter gives up his sort of life, to use that metaphorically, his own at bat, and yet the team can benefit by other runners advancing across bases and perhaps even scoring in the course of that possibility. So that's one of the key ways in which the word sacrifice will get used if you if you Google the word sacrifice, and then especially if you choose the news tab, let me add that qualification. So if you want to perform that exercise later, feel free. Now here's the other context, and you'll forgive me using an example from the United States of America, but perhaps it's more likely that their military exploits and ambitions will give rise to images like this. This is another context in which the language of sacrifice is readily used in public discourse. That is to say, the ways in which members of the armed services are offering or performing sacrifices through giving their lives for the greater good of the nation or the world or whatever it may be. I offer that example again without any moral judgment attached, just as I offer the Boston Red Sox, who are, of course, a theologically significant baseball team, unlike some others. But we don't want to get into serious conversations about heresy, do we? So this example, one of them apparently trivial and the other apparently tragic, have a similar logic in common, and they reflect what it is that secular discourse primarily understands when it uses the language of sacrifice. That is, that in both cases, an individual gives something of the thing of greatest value to them, which in the baseball arena is their own at bat, but which in life is indeed one's own literal physical life, give it up for the sake of the greater good. And that means that in effect, in the general use of the term sacrifice in our secular discourse, but also I think by implication in much of our theological discourse, we tend to mean by sacrifice that we accept or inflict violence upon ourselves in the belief that we achieve or receive greater goods by the acceptance or infliction of that sacrifice than we would if we didn't. So is that at least moderately clear, the sort of point I'm, now that you may have problems with that, and I do too, but what I'm really trying to get here is just to identify how we actually think the term is used and the idea is used in the wider reality of our secular conversation. Now, part of what's remarkable about that is that it's used in secular conversation. Even though people can be religious about baseball, and even though military service and the possibility of death in war is very much a part of civil religion, and certainly civil religion is the true religion in the parts that I now inhabit. Nevertheless, the fact is that language of sacrifice is used in contexts where people are not conscious of it having religious resonance, which is quite remarkable if we think about the actual origins of the idea of sacrifice and the places from which the term comes. Here's an interesting ethical reflection. Some of you will have come across Stanley Hauerwas, the American ethicist and theologian. And this is sort of a view from the theological sphere, but which draws upon a similar understanding about what sacrifice is. He says, the sacrifices of war, so we can think back to that cenotaph picture I showed you a minute ago, the sacrifices of war are undeniable, but in the cross of Christ, the Father has forever ended our attempts to sacrifice to God in terms set by the city of man. I've put the sick in brackets there. I'm not quite sure when it was written, but Christians have now been incorporated into Christ's sacrifice for the world, so that the world no longer needs to make sacrifices for tribe or state or even humanity. Now, this slide could come a lot further in our conversation, but I've offered it here just to illustrate a sort of bridge between the secular uses of the term sacrifice and the religious ones that continue. And Hauerwas's paragraph here actually sets the two in a kind of conflict, a conflict that's based upon their commonality, if I could put it that way. In other words, he thinks that we're wrong to think of war as a sacrifice because it constitutes a sort of failure to accept the reality of the sacrifice of Christ. And if we truly understood the depth and reality of the sacrifice of Christ, we would not need to go to war. In other words, he thinks that war itself is a form of sacrifice. It's not simply something that we talk about using sacrificial imagery, but that the ways in which it constitutes a different sort of ritualized bloodshed is actually a sort of act of national and international unfaith. So these theological and secular discourses intersect in some interesting ways. I have a light-hearted version of this intersection for you now. See if you can have a look at this. Now, this is funny, and I think it's very funny personally, because it shows the kind of collision of two different understandings of sacrifice. If yes, you see it drops after a minute, that penny, doesn't it? If I'd only showed you the caption, you would have conjured up a scene of parents sitting on a sofa, next to the standard lamp and the television, weeping as they listen to the sophomoric offspring home with a backpack on, telling them that they dropped out of college. But instead, what we see is this sort of primitive agrarian farmstead where the parents have apparently cut the head off various small animals over a long period with a certain seriousness in order to ensure the success of their offspring in the school. Now, the reason this is funny, and humor often works by incongruity, it's because of the collision here of two different understandings of what sacrifice means. The caption and the idea of dropping out of school and the parents sacrificing for the child, this belongs to the same logic as the logic of the baseball player or the logic of the soldier. That is, that sacrifice is a way in which we give things of great value up at personal loss to ourselves in order to achieve something good for others. So in other words, the parents could have been a third slide image alongside the baseball player and the casket of the soldier, all indicating a common logic of sacrifice as self-abnegation, of sacrifice as the acceptance of loss, and often of violence, sometimes literal and sometimes metaphorical or emotional, whatever we should say. But the visual image of this cartoon reminds us of a world in which sacrifice was something different from that. Because let's face it, in the world of the visual image, the parents themselves are not really the ones who are suffering, are they? You would be much more concerned about being a cow or a pig in this environment than you would about being the parents themselves.
Headless chicken.
And that actually tells us something which might help transport us quickly to the realm of ancient sacrifice. This is a scene from the Parthenon Freeze in the British Museum. We could start another argument here about whether they stole it from the Greeks and all that kind of thing. You remember this, the Elgin marbles. But this is a group of Athenians on their way to sacrifice a heifer at the shrine of Athena at the time of the Panathenaic festival. They are, like all the other people depicted on this scene, they are revelers, they are enjoying themselves, they're having a party, they're having a great time. And the only figure in this frieze who has anything to worry about by way of self-abnegation is the animal. Sacrifice in the ancient world is not particularly dangerous if you're a human being offering a sacrifice, just as the parents of the visual element of the cartoon don't have much to worry about themselves, but rather it is the animal who is the victim. And that shows us by implication, by the way, another thing that's different about the ancient and the modern views. In the ancient world, as in this frieze, there is a very clear distinction, in fact, a radical distinction between the one offering sacrifice and the victim being sacrificed, right? These figures wearing their robes versus the cow being taken to the festival. But in fact, in the examples that I showed you before from modern use, whether it's the family, the baseball player, or the soldier, is it not the case that there is a kind of fusion between the one making the offering and the offering itself? That what constitutes a sacrifice, when we use this language in our own ethical discourse, whether or not it's theologically loaded, is that what constitutes sacrifice must be a gift of self. And when we use this language theologically, even for instance, to talk about the practicality of something like giving, like our stewardship campaigns and the contributions we make to the church, when we use the language of sacrifice, we feel that it's justified when a person is offering in such a way that it inflicts something upon themselves, not simply because of the cash value of the gift, but because of its personal impact upon them and the ways in which it may constrain them from making choices in other spheres. So the ideas of sacrifice that we work with in the modern era, even though theologically loaded, are quite different from those which might have pertained in the ancient world. But there's a sort of trajectory between these two ideas. And I want to spend the rest of 5 or 8 minutes or so just doing a kind of whistle-stop tour from the ancient world through to the modern. And I suppose let me tell you the punchline before we start it. That across the course of Scripture and across the course of history, there is a movement from sacrifice as being the material offering of gifts external to the self, whose offering causes no harm to the offerer, but really constitutes something much closer to what we would broadly think of as a gift. There is a trajectory from that notion of sacrifice as gift to a notion of sacrifice as essentially bound up with experiences of suffering and abnegation. And the ways in which that happens, and the ways in which that trajectory also involves a movement away from the material, or at least away from the external material, to forms of dispositional offering or of ethical orientation, is part of the history of Judaism and Christianity themselves. Now, the image I'm showing you here, which is a medieval or Byzantine one, is actually intended to take you back to the earliest parts of the Hebrew Bible, of course. This is the story of Cain and Abel, who, at least in some views, are those who offer the first sacrifices that are described in the Bible. This, of course, depends a little bit upon definitions, and if we had longer, we'd talk more about this. But you may recall that both Cain and Abel are said to bring offerings to God. Abel brings a lamb. In fact, what the text says, he brings the lamb, the fat portions thereof, which implies that the lamb had probably undergone some experience of abnegation prior to him bringing the pieces. And Cain brings of the fruit of the ground or the fruit of the earth, some kind of vegetable or grain offering. And the offering of Abel is accepted, but that of Cain is not. However, there is no mention of an altar, despite the fact that the Byzantine mosaicist has added one. And the language that's used of the offerings is ambiguous. It's not the language that's later used in the Hebrew Bible about sacrifices. So are Cain and Abel offering sacrifices or not? Well, that's a longer story, and we won't pause there. But part of the reason that the Cain and Abel story gets caught up very thickly into our conversations about sacrifice is because of the second part of the story. And you'll remember that after God accepts the sacrifice of Abel but rejects that of Cain, that Cain rises up in jealousy and kills his brother Abel. And the violent act, which happens, sort of, if I may use an analogy, the violent act takes place not at the altar rail, but at the coffee hour afterwards. Nevertheless, the proximity of the two events is such that they've sort of been melded in the Christian imagination, at least, not so much in the Jewish imagination, I think, but certainly in the Christian imagination, so that we think of the death of Abel as the sacrificial act that's taken place in the course of that narrative, rather than the dismemberment of the lamb, which is only a bit player in the story. So this is one foundational story of sacrifice. Here's another one. You're going to hear a bit of, well, if your lectionary is the same as the one I'm preaching from at a local church on Sunday, you'll hear part of this story on Sunday. William, is that right? You're going to get the Noah story on Sunday? Or shouldn't I be putting you on the spot to know whether you've prepared that?
You shouldn't be putting me on the spot because
anyway, this is Noah. And the top half of the page is the happy part, where he proceeds out of the ark with his sons and their wives, and the animals are going 2 by 2, and you almost want to break into one of your favorite Sunday school songs or whatever. But then you look at the lower part of the image. This is from a manuscript, by the way, a 6th century manuscript of Genesis. And you'll see that Noah is doing just as the text actually says. Noah took of all the clean animals that came out of the ark, and he offered them on an altar. In fact, this is the first altar that ever gets mentioned in Scripture. Noah builds an altar, and he slaughters representative animals that have come out of the ark. Presumably more came out than went in. Otherwise, you can imagine the animals were wondering why they bought their tickets in the first place, really, wouldn't and this is the first time that anyone offers what's described in Scripture as a whole burnt offering. And the whole burnt offering, of course, doesn't give rise to a barbecue feast the way some sacrifices do. It's simply the victim is destroyed and offered to God. That same language of the whole burnt offering is used for another famous story. Here's another 6th century image, by the way, which looks so different from the other one, but this is on a mosaic. This is in Galilee at the Beit Alpha synagogue, which you can see via a visitor's center. And Abraham here, looking a bit pear-shaped. Perhaps this is a way of indicating his advanced age, and some of us understand this. Abraham is about to offer Isaac on the flames, and the hand of God, conveniently over to the left of the screen, if you can see that, the hand of God is reaching from the clouds saying, do not kill the boy Abraham. Now Abraham is offering Isaac, although he doesn't, is in the same kind of burnt offering mode that was being applied by Noah to the animals coming out of the ark. So in the earliest texts of the Hebrew Bible, and in fact most of the Hebrew Bible, sacrifice simply means acts like this. It means acts in which adult humans, always males, by the way, which is something else we could consider at greater length, males take representative animals from their flocks or herds, and occasionally human beings, and offer them God as gifts, either by wholly destroying them in fire, or by slaughtering them and by partitioning the carcass and sharing some of it in a sacrificial feast. They do so typically at altars. This is an actual altar that was discovered at Megiddo. Some of you may recall texts which talk about the horns of the altar. Does that ring a bell? This is an altar with horns. So this is a sort of a place where perhaps the drink offerings might have been poured, or where the sacrificial remnants might have been destroyed. But here's a quick summary of the stories we just looked at. Cain and Abel offer gifts called a mincha. This is your Hebrew 101 lesson for the week. Cain and Abel offer a gift called a mincha. Noah and Abraham, their whole burnt offerings are both called an olah. And then Jacob, the patriarch, who also offers sacrifices which people get to eat and drink, has a completely different set of words for them, the nesek and zebach. Now, the reason I show you this sort of rather obscure Hebrew text is simply to point out that when ancient Israelites talked about these different offerings, they didn't necessarily even think there was one idea called sacrifice. There wasn't even necessarily one idea called sacrifice, but rather each of these different offerings had its own logic, had its own purposes. Not all of them were about the forgiveness of sins, for instance. Some of them were about giving thanks to God for services rendered. Others were offered because they had seasonal significance. The Passover, of course, will come to mind, which we'll be thinking about in weeks to come. I've parsed these different stories of sacrifice out to this extent to make that point, that another of the things that we're inclined to do with our singular and synthetic understanding of sacrifice is to make the assumption that it's always about one thing. And what, of course, we tend to think that the one thing is that it tends to be about expiation or propitiation, that is to say, about the forgiveness of sins. But for the ancient Israelites, there were different sacrifices for different occasions. And again, I'm not going to give you a test on the Hebrew here. I'm simply pointing out that sacrifice for the ancient Hebrews is more like a portfolio or menu of performances depending upon which effect or which duty you are performing. So think of your book of alternate services and the fact that you turn to different pages, for different activities. So too, if you read the book Leviticus, which is sort of the handbook for how sacrifices are supposed to work in the Hebrew Bible, you'll see that there are a whole range of different things. And one thing you'll notice, even if you don't have any Hebrew at all, is that the words in the first column, olah, minha, zebach shalamim, hatat, asham, have no relationship to one another lexically, right? Whereas if you look up your English translation of the Bible, you will see them all translated with the word sacrifice or the word offering added in order to make them sound alike to us. When in fact, from an ancient Israelite or Jewish point of view, they're not necessarily variations on a theme, but quite distinctive forms of ritual activity. So the idea that sacrifice is one thing and that it always has the same purpose comes through a separate process. It's the process of translating sacrifice, in effect, from the Israelite worldview into the Greek one. Now, the Greeks basically did have one form of sacrifice. They used the word thusia for it. Again, we won't have a test about that, but sacrifices were very popular with the Greeks. They were almost always involved with feasting. It was very rare for sacrificial victims in the Greek world to be destroyed utterly. Rather, they were typically slaughtered and then offered for feasting by the participants in the religious ritual. And if you think you don't know about that, then think again, because if you've ever read Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, Think about those passages where he talks about food offered to idols and about the anxiety that the Corinthians feel about whether or not they should go to the dinner parties of their pagan friends where meat that comes from pagan sacrifices is being eaten. It was a very common affair. As the Old Testament got translated into Greek, and as the New Testament itself was written in Greek, the complexity of the Hebrew view of sacrifice as being a whole bunch of different things tended to be reduced to just one or two. And I won't dwell on this particular slide lest it distract us with only a little bit of time. But the idea of sacrifice was formed, in effect, not in the Hebrew Bible, but in the transition out of the Hebrew Bible and culture into the Greek language and then into early Christianity. The story that I have up here, and I'm realizing I'm running towards the end of my time here, but this is an extract from the fourth book of the Maccabees, I think, rather than the second, yes. And if you've made your way through the first two books of the Maccabees, you get a gold star anyway, because they're in the Apocrypha. But there are four books of the Maccabees, and third and fourth ones are canonical in some of the Eastern Orthodox churches. But part of what's interesting about them is that they depict the sufferings of Jewish people under the persecution of the Greek Hellenistic kings, of Antiochus IV Epiphanes in particular. And it's only at this point, this is, by the way, just a couple of hundred years before the time of Jesus. It's only at this point that the idea that a human life in its noble self-offering could be considered a sacrifice comes to light. It's only at this point. This is not something we find in Leviticus. It's not something we find in Genesis. It's not something we find in the prophets or the Psalms. Am I getting my point through? The idea is that the Hebrew Bible doesn't understand the idea of human self-offering in noble self-abnegation as having anything to do with sacrifice. Sacrifice is about the offering of external objects, of property, of animals, of wheat, or whatever it might be. But in the stories of the Maccabees, we hear the notion that martyrs begin to think about their own lives using the metaphoric power of animal sacrifices as a way of thinking about making sense of deaths that would otherwise have seemed senseless. So when a martyr like this Jewish man dying in torment says, "Make my blood their purification and take my life in exchange for theirs," he's using language which is sacrificial as a metaphorical framework through which to understand his own suffering. Of course, this is written by another author, performing that act of interpretation. But this was radically new. It's not something that we find in the Hebrew Bible in the sort of stricter, narrower sense. So now we come to my sort of abrupt end at a place that is more familiar to us in the New Testament. In the New Testament, of course, we find that tradition that appears for the first time in the books of the Maccabees taken to a new place, because Christians understand that the idea of sacrifice provides them with an interpretive framework through which to think about the noble suffering and death of Jesus. And it also provides them with a framework to think about the life of the Christian. And that's really where the topic for tonight comes from the second text in front of you. But I've got a famous text about each of those two interpretive moves here. The author of Ephesians, whether this is Paul or someone writing in Paul's name, says, "Walk in love as Christ also loved us and gave himself on our behalf, an offering, a prosphora, and a thusia, a sacrifice to God, as a fragrant aroma." So Jesus there is being figured as a kind of sacrificial animal in terms that would have been comprehensible.
Uh-oh. Are we losing Andrew? Sorry, folks. Can you hear, see?
On the left, we have Abel bringing his lamb. On the right, Abraham brings Isaac, but there is no knife because this is no longer a violent or dangerous situation. Notice also that Abel is quite happy and hale and healthy. And the third figure, of course, is Melchizedek, the mysterious priest king of Genesis, who also appears in the letter to the Hebrews, and who is described as greeting Abraham with bread and wine, which, of course, the early Christians saw as types of the Eucharistic elements themselves. the early Christian Eucharistic understanding of sacrifice was that all of the stories of the Hebrew Bible were summed up both in Christ's own self-offering, but also in the Eucharistic offering, which was performed on tables that looked like this in front of the devotees. And in a sense, this remains our Christian theological position, that all those all those sacrifices, historically distinct and diverse in their different ways, do all find a kind of fulfillment and a representation, both in Jesus' own offering and in the offering of the Eucharist. But if we affirm that, we're not just affirming that sacrifice is to do with self-abnegation, because many of those stories, of course, have nothing to do with self-abnegation. What they do all have to do with is gift. And my humble theological takeaway would be this, that if we continue to think about sacrifice as a useful term to think about Eucharist and to think about Christ, and I believe we should, then our theology would do better to understand that the primary thing we're affirming in talking about Jesus as a sacrifice, or the Eucharist as a sacrifice, is to understand that they relate to our relationship with God as characterized by gift, rather than by suffering or violence inherently. The fact that Jesus' own life in its historic and human form was ended by political violence was something which the earliest Christians learned to interpret using the imagery of sacrifice, not because it was in harmony with the idea of Jesus' death, that violent political death that looked nothing like a sacrifice, but rather because the idea of sacrifice was so different from it. And that understanding, of course, is very much related to what we also affirm in the reality of Jesus' resurrection, is the fact that what God does with Jesus' death is something rather different from what the Romans did with Jesus' life and death. So that went a bit longer than I should have, William, but here we are. So we're open.
Wow. Thank you. That was quite a pit stop through some fascinating material and to the present day. So let's throw it open. I'm sure that people have resonated with some and curious about others. And so I guess we can do it by hand. So Pat, why don't you start? Pat, Brian? And I guess you unmuted? Can you unmute?
Go.
There we go.
Okay, here I am. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. The thing that occurred to me listening to what Andrew was saying, it seems to me, for example, I'm sure that the people in Texas having all that snow have one word for snow. They may have several adjectives as well, but at the same time, they have one word for snow. That's a cultural thing. Here, of course, in Inuktitut, the language of the Inuit, they have something like 33 different words for snow, because they live with snow all the year round, or virtually all the year round, and so on. And so first of all, I think there is that cultural thing that occurs. We appear to only have one word, sacrifice, and there don't seem to be any other synonyms for it. Even perhaps propitiation is the only one that we use, certainly in our liturgy as well. The thing that occurs to me, of course, is that this whole idea of sacrifice. I'm starting to study Louis Follent with a group at the moment. I noticed that he says that the idea of Jesus sort of sacrificing himself just so that God would let us off or give us a ticket out of it was not true. It was nonsense, of course. God could have let us off anyway if he wanted to do it. He didn't have to take some innocent person to do it. But the whole point, of course, it always seems to me, is it's not so much the so-called sacrifice, it's of course the resurrection. Because the sacrifice would have meant absolutely nothing if there was no resurrection.
Yeah, thank you. A number of helpful points there, I think. I think you're right. And Lewis, of course, was a translator of St. Athanasius on the Incarnation, and I think he makes that point very much in keeping with Athanasius, that
Yes.
this had simply been about, taking the life of Jesus as some sort of a recompense or some sort of penal element. This would have been both repulsive and ineffective. And the importance of the resurrection as the basis of atonement seems to have been much clearer to the fathers of the early church than it was to some of the great medieval theologians. And sometimes, some of you will be aware that sometimes Anselm is blamed for a kind of paradigm shift around this issue, because Anselm's emphasis upon a sort of legal or forensic framework for atonement led many people subsequently, including a lot of the people who argued around the time of the Reformation, to assume that sacrifice itself also had a kind of legal or forensic kind of meaning at heart.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, in fact, it did not. In a different version of this lecture, or a different lecture altogether, I could have concentrated, or tried to, on the history of expiation or propitiation themselves, and that might have been equally or more interesting. But I think that part of what my point was that these notions of propitiation and expiation were, at the earliest point, only one of the understandings about how sacrifice worked or what it was for. And so, to give another example, the Passover, which is one of the more famous sacrifices that we know about, and in the American liturgy, I can't remember if it's in your BAS as well, in the American liturgy at the fraction, the most commonly used anthem at the fraction is "Christ our Passover has been sacrificed."
Sacrifice for us, yes, that's right, yeah.
Let us keep the feast. This is fascinating because it's another Pauline line, of course. It's from Paul in Corinthians again. But see, the Passover sacrifice was not a sacrifice for atonement, not a sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins. It was a sacrifice celebrated annually as a way of participation in the redemptive saving power of God in the life of the Jewish people. And if any of you have taken part in the Seder or read Haggadah of the Seder, which of course is a later text than the time of Jesus, you'll see the emphasis in that about how the participant in the Seder is not to say that this happened to their ancestors long ago, but rather this happened to us. So that the celebration of the Passover is a way of realizing and making present the freedom and liberation that God brought Israel by bringing them out of Egypt. And there's nothing in there about anyone's sins being washed away, or anyone's sins being overlooked, or anything else. It's not about sin. It's about the destruction and defeat of evil. And that's what I wanted to sort of say in reference to Pat's emphasis upon the resurrection as key to understanding the saving power of Christ, that it's God's victory over death is at least as fundamental an image in Christian theology as any notion of atonement working by propitiation or expiation. I don't mean in saying that to say that those images are not useful or interesting. I mean to say that atonement has always been in search of the right dance partner to explain itself at any point in Christian history. And the partners change from time to time. And sometimes we use metaphors of expiation or propitiation, and other times we use metaphors of conflict and victory and liberation. And the tradition allows both of these to function for us depending on what our need is.
Yes, indeed.
So I hear Suzanne, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. First of all, a question just to be clear. When you're speaking of sacrifice, is it always to death, or are you broadening that word to a more modern understanding as well?
Yeah, fair question. I think in both, I've sort of suggested two understandings, if you like, the ancient ritual one and the modern ethical one. I don't think literal death is implied in either version, as a matter of fact, although in the modern one, I think there's always some symbolic death. So even, the batter in the baseball game is sort of dying as far as the metaphor of that inning is concerned, But in the ancient setup, if we actually walked through Leviticus and looked at the different offerings, for instance, we get a bit of a surprise in the second chapter of Leviticus after it's gone to great lengths to describe in Leviticus 1 how the whole burnt offering is supposed to be chopped up and burnt. The second offering, the second most important one in Leviticus, is grain, cereal offering. So death is clearly not essential to the idea of what Leviticus has in mind when it's talking about offerings. It's the action of giving them that's really the heart of the matter. And I think it's true of Israelite sacrifice, and also for that matter of traditional Greek sacrifice, even though that's of less theological interest to us. But I think it's true that the death of the animal is almost an incidental act. I mean, I realize you may think that that's odd and that you may not want to accept it, but I think the death of the animal is something the animal has to undergo before you can eat it. And so to give the animal to God or to give the animal to your friends, its slaughter is simply a predicate, that has to be passed through. It then, of course, becomes true that the profundity of death is not overlooked. So that, for instance, then both Greek and Israelite sacrificial ritual then tend to add ritual details that relate to the disposal of blood, for instance. Mm-hmm. And you may recall that in the Israelite tradition, in fact, this even goes back to Noah, that the blood has to be treated as a sacred substance. In fact, remember that Noah is not yet a Jew. We don't have Jews for quite a while after Noah. But Noah, who is the ancestor of all humankind at that point, Noah is instructed by God that he can have sacrifices and that people can start eating meat now because they didn't do so well on their vegetarian diet back in the garden. But he says, but you shall not eat the blood. The blood is sacred to me. And so the blood always gets treated as as a sacred substance. And I take that, perhaps a little speculatively, I take that to be some sort of nod towards the fact that death is a significant thing. Yeah. But I don't think that the killing of the animal is what constitutes the sacrifice. I think it's just a necessary precondition for the animal to be offered.
Is there something else behind your question, Suzanne?
Yeah, because it's going to lead me to, I of course leapt up at your comment that sacrifices are made by men in the Bible, but not by women. And my comment then would be that they're made by women, but they're not named as sacrifice because women didn't, for the large part, count. The Mary's sacrifice of her son to there are several places where women actually have a strong, what we would call a strong sacrifice that they make, but it's not using the words that you've used.
Yeah.
If I'm interpreting correctly.
No, it's true. Although, again, I'm not trying to sort of push that angle too hard one way or the other. I think you're absolutely right that once you make that shift that says that we can talk about significant acts of self-giving, including acts that involve loss to ourselves, as soon as we can talk about those as sacrifices, then a whole other range of human activities become available for this kind of thing, and women's participation in them becomes perhaps more evident there. Someone might say, though, that despite the undoubtedly patriarchal nature of the Israelite sacrificial system with male priests and male devotees bringing the animals and so forth, that the offerings that they bring forward, the animals themselves, for instance, always have to be the product of farming. You can't bring a wild animal to an altar for sacrifice. It has to be a part of your own property, part of your own life. And so realistically, I mean, this isn't something the text addresses, but the notion that, women are clearly involved in the raising and the production, both of the plant and animal offerings that are brought to the temple, even though they're sort of erased in the course of the texts that describe how they're supposed to be offered. But this question of the gendering of sacrifice has caused quite a bit of ink to be spilt in the last 50 years or so. There's a fascinating book by a deceased American scholar named Nancy Jay, who draws some interesting inferences across sacrificial rituals in a number of cultures, all of which are patriarchal in nature, who seem to use sacrifice as a way of sort of ritualizing their patriarchy and the ways in which men get to function in certain public ritual roles seems to be a means of underscoring the distinction of gendered labor and gendered roles, so to speak. But that makes it more interesting. I think part of your point that's really interesting, Suzanne, is that once we acknowledge the power of sacrificial ideas to travel across the lines, the set of traditional ritual into other spheres of life, then those gendered boundaries tend to be weakened as well, don't they? And so, in fact, in those stories of the Maccabees, of which I just gave you a juicy quote, there's a mother in the second book of the Maccabees and the fourth book of the Maccabees who watches all 7 of her sons being killed by the wicked Greek idolaters, and she is a kind of model. I don't know how you would put her. She's as much a priest as a sacrifice, though, I guess, because she's the one who offers each of her sons in the name of righteousness, because she coaches them not to give in to the wicked idolaters and to eat pork and to avoid suffering by giving in to the impious desires of the king. She coaches them to offer themselves sacrificially, in effect. So she is a kind of pre-Marian figure almost in her relationship with her sons.
Okay, fascinating. Now, Jim McGrath, I'm hoping you're going to jump in here. But
David had a question in the meantime too.
I do. It's a fairly simple one, but I've always had a little trouble with it. I think you can probably help. It's the relationship between sacrifice and the offering, where sacrifice fits in.
Which is sacrifice. Where is the distinction between the two? Yeah.
Yeah.
This is
suffering. The connection between suffering and sacrifice.
All right. So I think this really only comes about, and this I'll try and give the answer and then comment on it. This nexus, this connection, really only comes about at this same point, quite close to the time of Jesus, where the idea of sacrifice travels metaphorically to be applied to stories about human beings. So these young Maccabean martyrs they become sacrifices because they are suffering. And the way in which Jesus himself is interpreted as a sacrifice, I think, has to do with something similar. I mean, it is worth pausing, by the way, to realize how extraordinary and how, well, let's say weird it is to think about calling Jesus a sacrifice, because no one at that point assumes that anyone who dies a violent death unrighteously is thereby a sacrifice. Sacrifices are still things you do with chickens in temples, right? Not ethical, heroic performances. So the church's claim that the ignominious death of Jesus as a political criminal, judicially murdered by the Romans, actually had the significance of the most extraordinary, gorgeous, festive religious rite is as radical a claim, in a sense, as the claim of the resurrection itself. But it is true that, to go back to try and answer David's point, that that possibility arises because of a strand of thought that had begun to emerge before Jesus about the idea that human behavior itself could be thought of using the imagery of sacrifice, a part of which was the fact that if the sacrificer and the victim were the same, then suffering starts to become a relevant factor in considering who and what a sacrifice is. But you will note that in the Hebrew Bible, no one is much interested about the suffering of a sacrificial victim, because the sacrificial victims go from being the inert vegetables of Leviticus 2 to being the domestic animals of Leviticus 1 or 3. And the fact that they suffer has nothing to do with their effectiveness as sacrifices. That comes into play later.
But Christ's sacrifice is enhanced or made greater by his suffering prior to. No, or is that not
No,
the right way to look at this?
it may be true, but I would just qualify it this way. The thing that makes Jesus the sacrifice par excellence, other than his status, the status that we affirm about his own being, as fully divine and fully human, and therefore the status as his status as victim. The connection between sacrifice and his suffering is that it is a measure, like his status, of the significance of his gift. And I think that the gift notion has to be the thing that interprets the sacrifice notion, but that doesn't take away the significance of the sacrifice for me, but rather it interprets it. I mean, because let's go back to the issue that Pat raised through, or C.S. Lewis raised through Pat. God does not will the death of a sinner, neither does God will the suffering of the Son. But the self-offering of the Son to the Father, the complete gift of the Son to the Father, is made known to us through what the Son was willing to endure in order to make that gift. So the suffering can be for us a sign of what that gift was, but suffering has to take on that significance because of the character of the gift, I think.
Well, that helps me to understand. I'll shut up. Helps me to understand your idea of the Eucharist being a gift. That was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Marion.
Just wondering, how does this mesh with atonement?
Yeah, very significant. So there's another whole lecture there, but which I promise I won't give you. But say one thing perhaps. I think that atonement, as it's worked out in the New Testament, is worked out unsystematically, and I don't think that's a problem, by the way. And I don't mean to sort of sound too. I'm not trying to upset too many apple carts in saying that, but atonement is in essence the way in which God overcomes the estrangement between God and the world, or between God and humanity. Now, the way in which that happens is depicted in the New Testament differently in different texts. And this relates, I think, to my rambling comment before when Pat made his point, that atonement is sometimes depicted as God's victory over the powers of sin and death that separate us from God. And atonement is sometimes depicted as God's liberation of us from slavery to sin and death. And atonement is sometimes depicted as purifying us from the taint of sin or wickedness. And that's often where people tend to go when you think about atonement per se, but that's actually only one image among others. So in fact, in the New Testament, we get political images, economic images, interpersonal relation images, and we also, of course, get the image of sacrifice. But sacrifice is itself a multivalent image. So it serves as an image of what God achieves in atonement. But even then, I think that doesn't narrow it down to one idea. And I think, in the end, I would say that atonement is too rich a theological theme to simply be reduced to one proposition. So, sometimes people argue about the kind of thing that people argue about in public is about penal substitution. I don't know if that is a thought that sort of popped into the minds of some people here. That was relevant to Pat's comment earlier. There are elements in the New Testament that talk about Christ paying a penalty, and elements in the New Testament that talk about Christ dying in our place. But they're not the only ones, and they're not the basis of a systematic theology of atonement, to me, at least out of the New Testament. And that's why I think it's a shame when some strands of our tradition want to insist that penal substitution is the only way to understand atonement, because I think the tradition actually contradicts them, not because those images don't exist, but because they don't trump all the others. And the sacrificial images in particular, I think, don't support penalty as such, because when a sacrificer in ancient Israel brings an animal to the altar, they're not offering it instead of themselves. That doesn't happen. The only cases you could say was anything like that would be the scapegoat ritual, which some of you may know of, the Day of Atonement ritual. But guess what? What happens to the scapegoat? Anyone know? The priest lays hands on it to convey the sins of the people onto the scapegoat, and off it goes. out into the wilderness. It's not actually killed. It's not sacrificed, if that's what sacrifice means. So it is all about atonement, absolutely. And I think that, the New Testament witnesses to the amazing, rich attempts of the writers to come to terms with what they know about, what they know intuitively, or what they know in the church about how the life has changed completely because of Christ's saving action. And then they actually give us an array of symbols and ideas to think about it with.
Great.
Sacrifice is one.
So I spoke with Andrew about having this till 8:15. We're gonna do 10 minutes or so. So maybe we can go around and make sure everybody who wants to ask a question or make a comment can do so. Brother Ted.
It's Ted here, and as I mentioned, I'm related to the sponsor of this outing, so I'll keep this brief. But Andrew, interesting in terms of your scene setter with respect to baseball and war. I would submit that with baseball, while we may think that the player is actually the hero, the player is caught in the ethos of the game, is the wrong position at the wrong time. And he is instructed to actually sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, the soldier is caught in the ethos of the state to go to war.
Yeah.
And he's expected by the state to sacrifice, and he is not a hero. He is actually given up for the sake of the state. Similarly, in the Maccabean scenario, the human sacrifice is the sacrifice for the state, not for, and dealing with how the individual is tortured, and it seems to be unfair. Actually, I think we see in the New Testament, after the resurrection, the ghosts coming through the city, which is a theological position that has come through that Maccabean resurrection scenario, that the human life sacrificed for a greater cause will come back to life. Mm-hmm. We haven't talked about the expiation scenario. And in your reading, I did note our good friend René Girard. He is dealing with that issue that the state actually sacrificed on behalf of the sins of the state.
Yeah,
which is a different take on, I think, where you're coming from.
It is a bit different, but I think I was quoting someone who thinks in similar terms in Stanley Hauerwas before. You
were, but I read your other note on René Girard.
Yeah, to your opening point, which I think is very well made, some of you may know Wilfred Owen's take on the sacrifice of Isaac. I don't know if you're aware of that poem called The Parable of the Old Man and the Young, where Wilfred Owen, who was one of the war poets, who was killed in 1918, retells the story of Abraham and Isaac very, very much with Ted's point in mind, where he basically, blames metaphorically through the course of the poem, he blames the generals and the industrialists for offering the young men. They didn't offer themselves; they were offered involuntarily, as it were. And I think that is a powerful example of how the sort of ideology of sacrifice can be used in order to justify forms of violence that protect the self-interest of certain particular groups. The Girard thing is an interesting story that we don't have time for, and I actually am giving a talk tomorrow in a class taught by my colleague Mark Heim. I don't know if anyone knows Mark's work, but he's written one of the best books about sort of the crucifixion in the light of René Girard's sort of theory and theology. And not everyone will know this stuff, but just in a nutshell, I think Girard has some very powerful points when it comes to the issue of what he calls mimetic rivalry and the scapegoating mechanism. Mm-hmm. As a historian and a sort of a theorist of sacrifice, I'm unsatisfied by his attempt to claim that sacrifice in general, like sacrifices of pigs and cows and wheat, are always attempts to cover up the fact that we always want to murder each other. Because I think that he's reading back too much of the sort of later history of how sacrifice became metaphorically applied to violent acts and retrojecting that to the beginning. But that's a side issue. He's interesting and illuminating. And I think the point, I completely agree with you. about the political significance of how ideas of sacrifice are used and misused in relation to telling people that they're sacrificing themselves or being sacrificed, when in fact it's the interests of others that are being looked after.
Yeah, we're fascinated about the whole connection with Girard, which I know many have read. But so a few more minutes. Jim, come on. You must have a comment.
All right, all right. You want me to comment? I will.
I'm sorry. We had this conversation back in December, so.
I want to go back to the idea of human sacrifice, and let's go right back to Abraham. I mean, one of the standard interpretations is that is the sign of the abandonment of human sacrifice by monotheists. And then skip forward to the conquests of the Holy Land, and the Jews witness their enemies sacrificing their children from the walls in hopes of winning the battle. And now if I could step back again to Leviticus, which I think is people overlook a lot and is a very important concept here. During the time of the wanderings, the firstborn son of the family belonged to God and was given over to the priests. And you could redeem his life back at a cost. You had to basically pay the priest plus interest on what he was valued as. So I assume his value was set as a slave. But the idea of redemption is in there. You can do the redemption. Now, if we jump that forward to Christ's sacrifice, difficulty with this surgical dissection of the different parts. Oh, it's the redemption that's important, and then you'll get the Spanish to say how the death is important. They're independent. One cannot exist without the other. And moreover, if we look at Lazarus, and I'm going to bring that into it too, Lazarus dies and he's brought to life by Christ, but that isn't a redemption. To get the redemption, you have to go through what Christ went through to die. And that's why it's central to the Mass. Without that kind of sacrifice, without that kind of suffering, you don't get the glory of the redemption 3 days later. So I get very disturbed when people start to parse these things. It can't be, and I have a very technical, literal mind, but it can't be divided that way, surgically separated. You have to take the whole and take the wonder of it. And maybe we should think a little bit more about the wonder of it. I've never fully understood the Mass, although it's been with me for 70 years now. But I don't know. I'd like to hear your comment on that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I am sort of chopping and dicing and slicing a little bit to separate some things out. That's true. But the reason is not because I think that they should be separated. It's more to take us to the kind of image of that last Ravenna mosaic that I showed you with the different sacrifices being arrayed around the altar. I think the problem with much of classic Eucharistic theology, and this is true of both Protestant and Catholic Eucharistic theology, even though they have very different views about things like, the real presence, is that they both work off a certain strand of Western medieval theology that makes suffering itself the interpretive touchstone for everything else. And that isn't actually allowing the whole thing to speak in its richness. That's using one particular interpretive strand to interpret everything else. Now, it seems to me that there is no avoiding, and I think my responses to David, I hope, should have been heard in that light. There is no avoiding the question that Jesus' experiences of suffering and death are fundamental to our experience of him. But the Church's choice to interpret his death as sacrificial is not based on the fact of his suffering so much as on the fact that it chose to interpret his death as a gift. And if we go back and look at the biblical stories, then the thing that makes something a sacrifice is not violence and suffering, but gift. Now, the fact that Jesus' own death involves that element is incontrovertible. And the fact that his suffering and death themselves actually substantiate the character of the gift is incontrovertible. But in fact, it seems to me that what the tradition in certain parts of the West has at times been guilty of is precisely the kind of thing that you've raised a sort of objection to, Jim, namely it's the tendency to reductionism. The reductionism is when you say that one thing explains everything else. In fact, I think that the tradition, if we look at it through a slightly wider lens, if we include more of the Eastern as well as the Western tradition, I do think that if you made me pick one thing that is the sort of interpretive touchstone for everything else, I'll absolutely choose gift over suffering every day. Not because I think that we can avoid or should avoid the question of how to interpret Jesus' death and suffering, but because I don't think that's actually the core of the biblical witness to what it is that's going on, either in the death of Jesus or in the experience of the Eucharist itself. And I think that the multivalent character of sacrifice in the Hebrew Bible and the sort of different sacrifices, therefore, that get brought to the Eucharistic table, a la Ravenna mosaic, are trying to tell us that there are different ways in which people bring their gifts, and that the Eucharist is bigger than any one theory, just as the atonement is bigger than any one theory. So this isn't about excluding the classical emphasis on aspects of Jesus, suffering. I mean, I have students praying the sorrowful mysteries of the Rosary on Wednesday mornings here in the seminary. We're not excluding that stuff, but the question is, what is the bigger context, the bigger picture that you put it in? And I think that's the sort of question for us going forward. But as you say, Jim, the Eucharist is bigger than any of our understandings of it. And we take a certain comfort in the fact that that's true of the sacraments generally, that God has promised to be faithful to us through the sacraments. And our understandings of these things vary and grow and ebb and flow from time to time, but the sacraments themselves persist, and they will prevail because God will prevail.
Wow. Wow, I'm so glad we're recording this because they were rich, juicy, and very insightful comments on it all. We've got just a couple more minutes. I know Graham had his hand up at one point, and Graham, did you want to make a comment, Graham Cotter? You're on unmute.
You're on mute.
Can you unmute yourself, Graham?
There we go. And people don't mind another few minutes after 8:15? Okay. There we go. Graham.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that you brought around the word giving and gift, because the whole thing is a gift from God to us, and we give a gift back. And the Mass really starts with the incarnation and ends with the glory. And I do want to mention something linguistic that is significant, that blessing is cognate with an old root of blotien, blood. And that we get a sign of that in the French word where bless means a wound. And also sanctification and involves sanguine. If you move into the French word too, blood, the sanguine and the sanctification. It's just one of those things we've inherited with language.
Yeah, thank you. Great.
So how are we doing up there, Carol or Deb? Do you want any final comment if you anything that's in your mind or heart? Or
I would just say that I very much appreciate Jim sort of talking about coming to the Eucharist with wonder, and also I think tonight our sense has been sort of expanded, and bringing in the various strains and growing with them, shaping our understanding, Eucharist by Eucharist and year by year. I really enjoyed that. I'm very grateful for that.
excellent. Yeah. Well, I can't thank you enough, Andrew, for taking time out to talk to a bunch of Canadians up here after a full day with your own students and all the both administrative and teaching work you're doing there. But as you said before, we're all part of the Commonwealth, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, I expected you all to burst into a chorus of God Save the Queen or something. Although, actually, we Australians are a little more iffy about that stuff than you, because for you,
we know.
She represents a bulwark against the United States, doesn't she? Whereas,
Yeah.
for us, it's a little different. But nevertheless, God bless her.
And now you've even banned Facebook. This is going to be a big.
Oh yes, that's true. Although my other proud sort of element of being Australian is if you've looked at the news about COVID in Australia and New Zealand for that matter, it basically whipped it. And I was there for 4 or 5 months last year through a mixture of chance and choice, and it's been extraordinary the difference between Australia, which takes it completely seriously, and the United States, where it's sort of like a lifestyle choice or something, as if public health could be handled as a matter of personal expression. It's kind of tragic. Anyway, so it's actually nice to hop across the border to experience civil society with a slightly higher tide, you know, as it were.
Thank you very much for that.
Well, although I hate to tell you, after 5 years of waiting for this discussion, I think we've only scratched the surface for me wanting more. So I'm looking forward to that book. You say you're working on a book that might pull some of these things together. I don't know how else we can get into your classroom with Zoom or other technologies, but anyway, for all of the folks here who have joined us tonight, I really thank you for your time. And I mean, it's perhaps not for the faint-hearted to come on a Zoom call and talk about hear about these matters, but you know, as Christians, in our prayer book, our hymn book, I mean, the word sacrifice is used so often, and particularly as we began, what this is to be a living sacrifice, I think is really what our call is. So, and when I first heard Andrew's Kellogg lectures, I began to feel more of what it was to be a living sacrifice. It had so many more ways of expressing what it is to be a Christian and to be that sacrificial person and to live a sacrificial life. So to expand, as Carol knows, to expand our understanding from the ancient Hebrews and through the Roman times and the early church to today, I think we are so blessed to have the richness which is inherent and which Andrew has made explicit for us tonight. So I hope more to come. But the text we still have and other things, but that sermon you gave at Church of the Advent in Boston, I sent that link. You can hear more of when Andrew, a couple of years ago, right, at the Church of the Advent. But right. You finished it with these words. So I'm going to quote you back to yourself because I think it may be an apt way for us to finish our time tonight. You say, "In our action and in our confession, let us continue to make the extraordinary claim that not one thing but many things, not one story but all stories, not one group but a countless throng are caught up together in the praise of the angels as our sacrifice, our gift, is taken by the angel to the altar and to the throne of God." That says it for me, and I think that helps sum up some of what you've been helping us to work through tonight. So again, thanks all.
Thank you, Andrew.
Andrew.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, William.
Thank you, William.
Good. See you next time.